I have this little tongue twister just to warm it up. I was
Hmm.
polys, pixel polys, vertices, and edges.
Oh, damn. Wow. All right.
Good,
Polys, pixels, vertices, edges.
good enough. Good enough.
Polys, pixels, polys, vertices, and edges. 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 Pixels, polys, vertices, and edges.
Welcome everybody to the Environment Artist Podcast. My name is Justin Rodriguez.
And I'm Ryan Benno.
We're two environment artists in the game development industry. I'm on the East Coast. I work at Firaxis Games, and
I'm, like I said, Ryan Benno, and I work at Insomniac Games on the West Coast in Los Angeles, California, United States of America.
so we're recording this today. I got in touch with Ryan, and I said, there's a lot of great game development podcasts out there, but I wasn't really hearing too much about environment art, and there's just so much stuff to talk about between just games in general and stages and levels, but also just creating environment art and cool techniques and pipelines that people use, and just talking about and celebrating certain art that's out there. So I figured that we get together and try this out and record a cool podcast.
Mhm.
So I guess the first thing we should get into, Ryan, is talking about what environment game art is. Do you want to take a stab at it first? Kind of, I guess, trying to define what we do.
Yeah, it's weird. It's it's hard to describe. So like the way, yeah, I don't know. Like I think of whenever I try to describe my job to people that aren't into games at all, it's kind of hard to describe, right? Like
Yeah.
games, you can say, "Oh yeah, I do the background design," right? Like that's essentially kind of what we say for the most part. And for a lot of other people, you can sometimes say, "Oh yeah, I do background design for games," right? But then they think of like, in a lot of cases, they're like, "Oh right, yeah, no." So like you draw all that stuff, and I'm like, "No, I don't really draw." I mean, sometimes if I have to do like, signage and posters or like, like the best way to kind of describe it is almost like theater production design or like set design, but you're doing it
Abs-
for like a 3D space. I guess is probably the best way to describe kind of what we do.
Absolutely. Yeah. Usually when I talk to people that don't work in the game industry, it's the first thing I'll go to is, have you ever played Street Fighter? And I work on the equivalent of the stages. So like I work on the backgrounds, not the characters. But yeah, I think that really
Mhm.
what
Yeah.
game environment art is now, with the way that how big games are getting, especially in three-dimensional space, and even with some VR stuff online, is like, yeah, what's going on in environment art now is really akin to set design and yeah, world creation, world building. I mean, just that the environments are getting so big in a lot of these games, and um, it's becoming a really kind of cool experience to kind of follow through with the technical aspects of it.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah, it's like we get to do a lot of stuff that I think even like set designers don't get to necessarily do, or like production designers on films do. We get people that can actually like be in our spaces,
yeah,
like in the, those cases, like they're very controlled in terms of the view that you see, particular about like shots, and that do, like 2D, like traditional 2D, very controlled view in terms of what you see. Or if you do
yeah,
a narrative game, potentially you have a lot of fixed cameras. But I think a lot of the games that we have, or some of the games you've worked on, where like you have like an isometric view for stuff. But
yeah.
you know, uh, that
It
can, right? They have their own challenges every single time, and you're like, oh, I can actually walk in the space. I can, if it's a first-person game, people can walk up to something you did, look up close to it, as opposed to, you know, in another game you might not be able to do that.
exactly. I mean, that's really what it pins down to is just the amount of immersiveness that and interactability or interactive nature of just games in general. I mean, you find yourself kind of building these worlds, creating these worlds is more than a facade. There's a lot of things that are going on into game environment art now, where albeit Easter eggs and little story environmental storytelling and little narrative clues that you're putting in games to have players kind of explore, not only in the game design but just as a little aesthetic notes to create this kind of mood and feel for the players to just be immersed in. It's just pretty exciting. I mean, I guess that's a good point to just basically talk about, what makes good environment art. If you have any opinions about that, and we can kind of go through that. And
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because like I think for most people they would say, well, it's like really good lighting and materials and stuff like that. But when you start getting to that form, it can be a little subjective, right? Like when you think of a lot of AAA games, which in this case are like large, big budget games, right? They're like, you're like Horizon Zero Dawns of the world, you're Uncharted's of the world. Like people would say, oh yeah, that stuff looks fantastic, but also, there's so many different styles that we can kind of work with. It does come down to a lot of basic fundamental like art skills that apply to really any type of art, right? Like good shapes, good composition in a lot of cases. Like, it all depends on not to get too overly complicated on the subject of what makes good environment art, but I think it's it is a little like you know it when you see it.
Heck
in
yeah.
certain cases, right? Like very much so nowadays.
It's funny that you say
I've
that.
even seen guys.
Oh no,
it's like
go ahead.
Like I've been seeing a fantastic guy on Twitter named Ethan Reed, and he's been experimenting even with like low poly PS1 Sega Saturn style looks to stuff. And for a lot of people that might be an aesthetic that's like, oh man, it's really kind of dated. But then you see the way that he does it, where it's very kind of clean shapes, clean colors, bright colors in like a lot of cases, and the stuff just looks fantastic, right?
Yeah.
So there's that perspective of it too, right? It's not just like, are you using the latest greatest like tech out there? Are you using engine that can provide you with like every single bell and whistle that you want for post-processing standpoint? Is your PBR in line? Are you using high resolution textures? Like that matters to a certain extent, but again, it is very much like kind of what I said earlier of like it when you see it.
Heck yeah. I mean, just establishing on that. It's like, I was playing through a couple games with my buds last night. We were going through all different types of Persona and Overwatch, and looking at the new Dissidia and Nier Automata. And it's the one thing, even though the fidelity and the of the assets in the sense of detail and photorealism and the style, the art direction changed between those games. The one thing that we noticed with all the games that was very strong is that they all established, supported, and maintained a mood, almost like a really good movie set. I mean, you really were like playing these games and you felt like you were kind of part of this world. The immersion was real because of just the really on point composition of not only the space and level design, but just the use of colors and the use of lighting and how everything complemented with one another. And it just feels great when you go through really good environment art, depending on whatever game it is. I mean, the one thing that I always go back to as well with good environment art is just the amount, because we are making game art, and it kind of serves the function of supporting whatever the gameplay is, and helps support that, is that the complement of the level design and the environment art, to me, like in that being like very close, be it collision or how the characters react to the environment, ambient animation, or just the colors of the space in comparison to what the design is of the specific game, just feels super good in the game. Like I always bring up Dark Souls. I won't talk about Dark Souls too much. It's like but when you play through Dark Souls, even though it's an older game, the art is one-to-one with the level design. When you put your foot down, I mean, you hit the step you hit the stair, and your character feels like he's kind of coasting around in this space, and it feels really good. Even though it's a kind of an older game, it's still fun to go back to, and it's something that I try to bring into my artwork. I always try to make like really clean environment art and making sure that it's really just serving the purpose of whatever the design of the game is that I'm working on. You talked about earlier before about just like environment art being very nebulous, and there's all different types of camera angles and different types of games out there. And the one thing that we did with XCOM over the couple years, many years at this point that I've been working on the franchise, is that we bring the camera in really low for the shot when you're taking shots at the aliens, and having that zoom in shot and then coming back to an isometric view was really challenging and fun, because the player was looking at the game in two different angles, and it wasn't just a fixed camera. So it really created a challenge to have all the assets hold up when you brought the camera in, and not just being a detail thing, but also all those camera shots feeling fun and engaging, and having the environments feel great while looking at isometric view, but also, behind the shoulder of the character. Yeah. So, I mean, I just think that's really the big thing for me. Is just always the back and forth with design, and where design and the environment art complements one another.
Yeah, for sure. And like, hey, look, not to brown nose you a little bit here, but there is something really magnificent during like XCOM, like the first time that I played it, and you get that shot, right? Like one of the first levels that I came across was that, I think it's like a street level, and there's like a shopping area, might be like a supermarket or something, and like the wall got taken out at some point, but then the camera comes in and I'm just shooting over, and you just get that sense of like there's actually been a battle here, right? Like It's not just my character leaning over a wall. The wall has been destroyed. It's part of the story that's happened during this mission that I've been playing through. And so the camera, along with how the environment is reacting to the gameplay, it really kind of creates this very like cinematic moment, which is like what I think a game like XCOM does incredibly well. Is like stuff like that. It's just like, oh, cool, this is like really neat, right? And like the environment reacts to specific things, right? So like that stuff is so from the game or from the standpoint of like gameplay, it's all happening gameplay, right? It's not a cutscene. It's not something that's like pre-made. It's something that happened dynamically because of the decisions I made, and because of the decisions, the enemy, AI made as well. But they're, you're playing this game back and forth on this stuff, and it just feels, it has that cinematic moment that I think gets used and thrown around a lot in this industry. But really, it's like, that's one of those moments. Like, yeah, this is great.
Heck yeah. I think that's like one of the biggest things about their biggest payoffs with really finding that sweet spot with environment art and marrying it to the level design of game and just the overall game design of whatever game you're working on. It's just you get this great emotional response, and it sticks with you. I mean, I go back with all my favorite games that I've played and all the favorite moments of those games and cinematic moments, and they're always within the gameplay. It isn't really a cutscene. It's just these big, if it's either a set piece moment where you're surprised with some new vista, or something as gritty and real as like you're talking about, just like an over-the-shot camera of something like XCOM, or I'm thinking of Gears of War with their focus points. When you click the button, and you can actually see things happening in real time, where they take the camera from you and show you, an objective point or a nav point. I love that type of stuff, when you're actually feeling like you're in the space and you're able to control your character. But it sticks with you. I mean, between the mixture of the colors and the lighting, it just feels like a good painting, but a painting in actual motion. I know that people talk a lot about cinematography and movies that way, and I really do think that movies incite that emotional response as well. But when you're actually in that space and you're able to move your character around and see all three dimensions and jump up and interact with things, I just think it's super fantastic.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think of stuff like, the first time you're riding on a horse in Shadow of the Colossus, heading towards like the mountain where you hold up the sword, and there's a beam of light, and you're just running, and just the way that it frames everything, the environment itself, right? Like, this is a PS2 game, obviously, next month there's a PS4 remaster, but there's, that game still holds up from an art direction standpoint. Maybe not from a technical standpoint in terms of what we would expect to see from a fidelity level now, right? Like
Yeah.
it's a game that runs in 480i, 480p resolution. Most games now try to run at about 1080p, right?
Yep.
Texture sizes, model sizes, quality isn't quite there, but the art direction is so strong in that game that it kind of overcomes a lot of that, right? And so a game like that will hold up, I think, longer over time than something you would see that maybe doesn't necessarily have that same, going back to the statement of having a strong art foundation.
Yeah.
It makes a huge difference in having an understanding of that, and also to the point of what you made too, right? Is we have to serve the purposes of design.
Absolutely.
Doing so doing open world games like Sunset Overdrive, we had restrictions to the way that we had to art buildings because our characters could run across the wall, but so we can fill the walls up with a bunch of different pipes and stuff, and vents and AC units and whatever else we wanted. But also, I think not necessarily a consequence, but a I can't think of the word. We'll do a consequence of this shit, but it's not a bad thing. But because of that, the style was able to be very kind of clean. So we didn't have a lot of little micro details necessarily on buildings. So it was able to have very kind of flat, clean, full color surfaces for a lot of the stuff we had, right? So it served the purpose of gameplay of making sure that it feels fun to play on when you're running across a building. You're not just running through a bunch of stuff that might hit you or just too much stuff that's on the screen that just feels kind of weird.
Absolutely. Yeah. The whole collision aspect and clipping through geometry is something that I know that a lot of games deal with, but it's something that we dealt with XCOM too. And it's just that the way that we made our buildings in comparison to yours, there's a lot of fracturing and destruction that goes along with the gameplay. So we really had to make our buildings a certain way so it supported that. And you really just try your best to kind of make specific kits and pieces to reinforce whatever's going on in the game and really try to showcase whatever that, those specific facets of gameplay are in the
very
game.
much so.
I think that's a really good kind of transition here to kind of get into the game art discussion of environment art. I mean, the one thing that's really interesting to me is that going to school, in high school, I knew I wanted to get into art professionally, whether it be an art teacher, or I didn't even have games on my mind at the time, or just being painting, part-time or whatever. I knew I wanted to do something, and I was really, really into landscape painting. I still am. I try to landscape paint as much as I can. I don't do it as much as I want to, but the one thing that game art that stands out from painting to me in comparison to game art is that game art has all these kind of, for lack of a better term, restrictions and rules that we set up. So the art runs well, the game plays well, and these limitations, while I don't want limitation to sound like a bad word, but that we have these certain rule sets that we do to keep things clean and have things run and fit on a disk and fit on certain types of computers and run on certain types of graphics cards. And I feel like all of that is really what kind of makes game art special. Game artists are really intelligent people that solve a lot of puzzles and a lot of problems to create some really fantastic art on screen and have it be in this immersive experience. I think what might be really interesting, and I'm getting a little long-winded here, but is to kind of, I guess, go through and talk about some solving visuals and within game art, and I would like to kind of get into talking about modular kits and kind of asset creation, and any thoughts that you have with that, and maybe some tips and tricks.
Yeah, and one of the things that I found a lot too as I've kind of progressed through my career too. So a little bit about my background too, right? It's I knew also I wanted to get into art to some extent, right? I knew I was either, I grew up right down the street from one of the most well-renowned animation schools in CalArts. So for a long time growing up, I was like, oh, I'm going to go to CalArts. I'll go be a animator. But I ended up falling into, after a couple weird stops along the way, into 3D art and really just falling in love with it, and also the sense of like set design and building that. And I think this is the path for a lot of us, and for a lot of people right now as well, that are starting out early in their careers. Like, you don't really necessarily have the experience of working on a team, and you're told through school, you're told online through other professionals of like, get a portfolio, get your stuff in there, get your scenes in there, and that stuff's all important, right? You still have to be able to make stuff of quality.
Yeah.
There's required a level of craftsmanship that a lot of places would expect when they're hiring people and looking to hire people. But there's a huge difference between making pieces for a portfolio, whether that's a small video or a couple screenshots, and a huge, huge difference between making an entire game that has to run, at a specific frame rate, a specific resolution, that fits on a disc for the most part for a lot of times. And the scope and scale of the game can change based off of the fact that you are making a specific type of experience that is sometimes devoid when you're just trying to make a pretty environment that's, for a portfolio. And that stuff, again, no discount against that, but it is a completely separate leap when you go from making portfolio work to properly being a game artist and understanding all of those technical limitations, and not just from a technical standpoint, but also from a production standpoint, a scheduling standpoint, all of that stuff.
Absolutely.
Really comes to the forefront, and you have to be able to adjust to that stuff. Otherwise, you're going to run it. You're going to have a bad time for the most part. Like, that's what you're going to end up having. So yeah, and the last handful of years for me has really been focused on that, right? Like, I've been super fortunate in my career to have worked with incredibly talented teams of really great craftsmen and artists and technicians in the environment department, as well as our support from people that work on our engine, internal engines, a core team or tools team, or technical artists, animators, or scripters, and guys that are able to make my life a lot easier in a lot of cases. Where I'm like, hey, I don't necessarily have material, I want this to work. And they're like, oh, I can do that, right? Like, that. And you have people that specialize in that. But I think as environment artists, a lot of us inherently aren't technicals, because we are. And for a lot of us tend to be more in that artistic end of trying to figure out, okay, I still want this to look really good at the end of the day, because that's all that matters. Like, they're not going to care that, like, I had to reduce this model down, 2,000 tries to get it into frame, or reduce the amount of LEDs, or add LED ins in there, right? Or how many textures or materials are on here. I just care that this thing looks pretty at the end of the day, and people like this, right?
Absolutely. I think that was one of the interesting things in general, is that when you're getting into the environment art, you always will have, nice set pieces and hero pieces, but really the cream of the crop ends up being these, really well thought out, almost puzzle-like assets and modular kits that fit together, that really kind of help block out the space and really fill it out and help out with whatever the level is trying to achieve within the game. I mean, there's usually, even if one game has a specific, design, I mean, like, level to level, you'll have, different cues or notes within the design and the environment art in general, where you're trying to solve these little problems. And I think that's what's really interesting about it, is that, you have all these beautiful assets, and it's like, okay, I have to make, these 10 things. How am I going to fit these 10 things into this space? I have this much time to do it. And I think that's the most enjoyable process, is that, you're sitting down, you're still creating art, but you're also having to kind of find fun solutions. And sometimes, painful solutions, depending on how much time or money you have, counting on who you ask. But you get this stuff in, and you realize it's like, now, man, like, all these little puzzle pieces that I made fit together, and I'm really just liking kind of solving these little situations and going from level to level and doing that is just something really unique, I feel like, to something that I've experienced in environment art, game environment art, than I have in any other art medium. I mean, you always will have certain things that push back in any medium that you know, be it clay or wood, and the wood grain when you're carving. But environment art's also, man, just because of the amount of kind of people that it takes, and having, you know, like a certain amount of artists, and you're all working together, just kind of spinning all these plates, and when they all get set down on the table together and, you know, dinner's ready, it feels like $1,000,000, especially those last couple weeks and months on a project when you start seeing everything fall into place.
Yeah, very much. You know, and like we're at a point now too where, just from a technological standpoint, like you're seeing a lot of games that are going to hold up visually more than I think is 2D era games, right? Like just from a 3D standpoint, like we're seeing stuff, you know, like that just is going to hold up, I think, much better than stuff that's happened even, like, you know, 5-10 years ago.
Yeah.
So, you know, and it's easier to make good looking games now. There's not, you know, the resources are out there in terms of just learning how to model, how to use the tools, how to use engines, of those engines to do what you need to do. It really just comes down to execution and, you know, the amount of time that you have. And in a lot of cases, it's also like, you know, ahead of time and saying, all right, I'm going to make this setup here. I'm going to make this system. Is this going to work for me a year or two down the road when we're having more than just myself or a handful of other artists? If we have 10, 15, 20 other artists on here, you know, are there going to be issues with me having this naming convention, or the way that this model is kind of set up kind of the way you were talking about in terms of like that stuff all really matters, and you have to take that into account. And a lot of times, you know, you may get lucky and you'll hit. There's also a lot of times where you're going to miss and you have to make some adjustments, right? Or stuff that was like, oh, we're going to do this because it worked on the last project and we're doing a similar thing here. And then you realize, actually, that doesn't work for whatever reasons it might be, right? It's a change in art direction.
Change in design.
It might be a change in scale. Like, it all can kind of, you know, matter. So again, it is very much like you have to be able to be aware of that stuff when you're working. And hopefully you're surrounded by a team that is trying to, you know, take a step back and say, what are we not doing well? Can we adjust this for this project at this moment? Or is it something that we're going to push off and say, we'll wait until we're done with this and we'll move on to the next thing, right?
Yeah.
For me, I'd rather work on teams that say, no, let's fix this now.
Absolutely. I mean, there's always, depending on what the situation is and where you are, it's, you know, you might have a different outcome, but the amount of iteration in game development, I know has been a big, I mean, there's bad iteration and good iteration, but iteration in general is something that really makes game development strong. You're able to kind of go through as cleanly as possible, make these kits specifically for environment art and assets, and, you know, you make them in such a way where you try to be as efficient as possible, and you might have to kind of come through and switch things up depending on design changes, or like a little tweak in art style, which it honestly is one of the more enjoyable things to me, is that you make you know, you're painting this painting, for lack of a better example, or creating this environment, and you stumble along a happy accident. You know, either you've put a piece in of a modular kit, or checked in a texture or something, and something just looks a little different, and you realize that, you know, man, if we had time to update A, B, and C, is this just going to look way better? This is, you know, what a great happy accident. And I think that's one of the more fun, or one of the more enjoyable aspects to kind of going through and solving these problems, or not problems is bad, solving these kind of like puzzles, and like solve these puzzles, or finding solutions to whatever. I'm like, hold on, Polly's puzzles, the you know, just trying to go through and solve whatever little issues that you're coming across, and working together to do this is really cool. I mean, like, and games are kind of getting bigger generally, some of the bigger AAA titles, and you're working with more people. And so the spaces end up getting bigger, but we've never really thrown away old techniques. I mean, if you go and look at techniques that we're using on older systems or in older game generations, we still try to keep that tech around and those pipelines around or little fragments from that stuff around, because it really does help a lot to keep this the art that you make for environments efficient and well made. It just means later on, hopefully, you end up being able to put more stuff in your game or polish more. And that's really what it comes back to. It comes back to that mood, the amount of polish that you get, and the really what you end up evoking for the player.
Yeah,
with that,
absolutely.
With that being said, I guess we can kind of go through some of the kind of like pipeline processes and just like kind of overall kind of scan through some of the footnotes of what it takes to kind of make environment art. And one thing that I kind of highlighted here is just gray boxing and like a proxy pass, which I've been seeing a lot more of recently in ArtStation and behind the scenes looks at other game developers, is that environment artists aren't afraid anymore to kind of show in progress work of games that come out, and that's really awesome to see screenshots like that. I remember seeing recently again, coming across it again, of some old Crysis gray boxes of some of their environments and then seeing the final product. And I love kind of getting my hands dirty. I mean, that's one of the things that I really like to do when working on a new project, is getting in there in pre-pro and just gray boxing out these spaces with the level designers and saying, okay, how's this space going to feel? And just knowing that, it's not going to be finished, but just kind of getting and trying to evoke these moods with just as little tech as possible, as little finished assets as possible, I think is really special, because that if you get it to a certain point with almost nothing, with no bells and whistles, that there's a really good chance that when you start filtering this stuff in and layering in these details slowly but surely, it's going to look and feel great. Do you do a lot of gray boxing where you're working now?
It kind of depends on. Actually, we haven't really. No, not lately. But like we do some things. It's kind of an extreme case, right? We had the original levels as our block out, so we brought those into our current tool set.
Awesome.
In a lot of cases, right? So that's in a lot of ways that's kind of our own block out. But it was like, here's the models, here's the textures from like 2000 or 2001 when the original team made this game, right? And so we would build off of that, and then if it's stuff that's like one-off sometimes, or like additional things, we might do a lot of block out, but we it's a lot of Houdini now to help us do stuff, and I can't get too much moment, but for stuff like Sunset Overdrive, we would have designers would go in and do blockouts of like what they wanted the space to be. And then because we're doing kind of an open world city, you spent a lot of time focusing on exterior. And because there's going to be kind of a reoccurring theme here on the podcast talking about modular pieces, because I know Justin spent a lot of time working with them on his end. I spent a lot of time on it. So, there's a lot of and again, this is that we've made. So this is our own experience on that stuff. But and so right, like we would usually have like most of our assets ready to go whenever we needed to go do like all right, I have this 3-block radius of a city I need to block out. Wall pieces that I've already been using on these other things during production, just kind of cover the building with it. At Telltale, we definitely did do a lot of blockouts, and that's because that game is more applicable to that, right? It's a lot of like traditional set design. You're going from space to space, and that stuff was always helpful. That's kind of where I first learned also about the idea of like actually doing like color passes on blockouts along the way, like just to be able to get like it kills 2 birds with 1 stone, or maybe more than 2 birds, but like you can get your lighting in there, because your lighting is also color to a certain extent, right? So you can kind of get those balanced out, get your color scheme ready. And then also part of it is that it can actually give you asset like lists, based off of like, originally I was thinking this wall was actually I need a little bit of like a trim piece down below, just some little lip down there, I don't have a texture for that, so I need to make sure that I have that in there, right?
Yeah.
That stuff can even add into there.
That's the one thing that's really interesting recently is I've been doing this a lot in my personal work is a lot of color blocking. I don't know if this is the best way. I mean, you can go in. I've been using a lot of Unreal 4 where I'll go in and kind of want to color block out. And at first I was just creating duplicates of these like very basic materials. And I was like, I really would like to kind of work with a color key that's more contained. I don't feel like having to go through and click on each one of these materials and then change the RGB value or whatever I'm doing. So what I've been doing now is actually taking like a little 512 by 512 sheet and with my proxy assets at home and kind of scaling them down, like UVing them really quick with flatten mapping or something like that, and throwing them into these little swatches, and then working with the swatches in something like Photoshop or Substance Design or wherever I am at the time, mostly Photoshop, because I like to use like a cooler or the color picker from time to time and just like get kind of crazy and see what I can do with color theory and just for fun. But I'll work with the swatches, and then when I change the swatches out, I always know that there I have in this little 512 by 512 like a little color key for my environment, but I also have it on the assets now, and it helps so much with scope. And just you start to look at the environment, and you're like, what am I going to do for reuse and stuff, and you start kind of making correlations to the different materials or colors that you're seeing in the space and what those materials might be, and then you're saying, oh, I can make this tiling texture sheet for props 1, 2, and 3, and I can use this over here. And then when I go and actually start resing in or filtering in the final assets, and I take out the proxy stuff, it always kind of fits, and it just makes it feel better and more alive when you're going through the project. And that's something that I would love to kind of filter into more of my professional work. But that gray boxing in general is probably one of my favorite spots. It's at the beginning. I love the stuff in the middle, but the beginning and the end, which is what I guess would be great to kind of talk about, is and I know that we'll have future podcasts where we get really into the nitty gritty of specific unwrapping techniques and making modular kits, and especially stuff for students later on. But just kind of like going through an overview of set dressing and just kind of like final polish is one of my favorite things to work on. You get everything in. You have at this point your game's figured out, and your style's figured out. Hopefully, you're just making little final touches or tweaks, but you're able to go into these environments depending on what your limitations are and what engine you're using, and just start, putting the narrative storytelling, tweaking the lighting, and kind of working with the colors here and there. I mean, that's probably my favorite part to work on. How about you?
No, that's that's the time that I love the most. It's also, I think we both could probably agree, it's the time you spend the least amount in terms of
yes.
Right? It's like you spend % of your time trying to just get there, and you're like, oh my gosh, I've spent so much time UVing this stuff, I'm over this. And then then it's like, cool, I get to polish for like 10 minutes. Amazing 10 minutes you have like during the day. You're just like, yes, I can do all this stuff, right?
Oh my gosh.
For me, definitely the best part of the job is really that stuff, right? And like secrets that like I love doing narrative design in environment art, and so that's where that really kind of shines, right? Is like you can spend a lot of time. It's at least nice, I think, in terms of a workflow in this stuff from like a narrative standpoint. It kind of makes sense, right? It's like you spend so much time doing modeling and UVing, you can kind of zone out at a certain point and be like, oh yeah, right, okay. When I get to like the polish stage for this, I can do this and this stuff in here, and this can all kind of connect, right? Like it gives you the time to like the project of what you might be on, right? There might be already a vision in place, but there's always ways for you to kind of add little things in there.
Oh, absolutely.
Intimate with the work that you're doing, that a director that's looking at everything from above, high up, and is caring about like 10,000 things at once, you can at least be like, oh, hey, I get what their vision is. I'm going to kind of
absolutely. I mean,
do what like I can to add on to this.
Yeah. That's the thing. It's like, hopefully at that point, like I said, it's like you have like this really, what the space is supposed to be, and then just adding these kind of errant details that allow the mind to kind of wander. So you have a player working through whatever space it is, be it a first person shooter or third person or a strategy game, and you just start kind of dropping other little assets in and creating other little stories, and it really does fill out the corners of a scene or of a level.
Yeah.
And I always think back to like even just
Yeah.
like old Street Fighter 2 levels. It's like you're playing this game, your main focus is two characters, but they have all these other people in the background, and most of them are like cheering, like but it's just cool, man. It's like you start kind of like looking at all this
Yeah.
stuff, and you're like, this is really what makes a space feel lively. And you get out there and you walk around wherever you live, be in the countryside or in the city, and you see trash on the ground, and there's all these little notes that you subliminally pick up on in your everyday experiences that kind of remind you subliminally that the world that you live in is just alive and kicking and just moving at this pace that you can't even really comprehend. And getting some of that
Yeah.
into a level just takes it so far out of a static space, and it does so much. And it's so
movement plays a huge part into that too, right? Like kind of what you were mentioning, right? It's like movement's a huge part of those background designs, right?
Heck yeah. Yep. Yeah, that's the thing too, is like ambient animation. Oof, it's like this is the podcast of gushing over special tech and details that you can put in your environment.
Yeah.
But it's just like, it's great. I mean, and the other thing that really it really stands out to me, like other than just like stages and fighting games, I mean, that's always going to be a big inspiration to me, but just Easter eggs in video games, just stupid little things that were kind of hidden by the developers back in the day when the teams were very small and they were just doing these little jokes. I mean, that's the stuff. You go back and look at certain Easter eggs from different games, they have almost like a mythical status, and it's just some dude or some guy or gal sitting at their computer just kind of messing around and just be like, I'm gonna place this here, but it just creates this mystery, and it just creates this depth to a level that really it might just be like, 4 walls and a floor and a ceiling, and it's just like, man, you're already feeling just like you're in some other space. I mean, and even going back to some of those games, I mean, it's awesome. I think that's like, even as games get bigger, it's hard to kind of get that stuff in, but like when you can, it makes a difference. It really does go the mile.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. That's it's really just like interesting. It's really just like I can zone everything out. I just focus in on it, and it's just very spontaneous, right? Like it's very much like, oh, I'll put this thing here, I can put this here, oh, I can put this kind of detail down here that I hadn't really, right?
Yeah.
It just trying to fill in the space with some variety of assets, right? And I think especially like large teams, kind of like what we do, you tend to usually have a large palette of assets to work from. And so that also helps out a lot, as opposed to if you're just doing personal work, like, all right, I have to make these, if you're doing like a storefront or something and you want to add, like racks of clothes or just like, displays of all the merch that you can buy, it's like, oh yeah, I have to make every single one of these things. And so how do I do that, right? And so at least, on a professional end, it's nice to be like, oh, cool, I have all these assets. Some of them I made, but a lot of them, the team has provided to some extent, and being able to just move stuff around, and it's fun, right? Like it's not, you're not focusing on like the materials of specific like objects and making sure, like building a model is fun in its own right, but I think that there's a very specific, special kind of like joy that comes out of just that sense of creation that gets kind of halted when you're having to actually produce a prop as opposed to just like creating a scene.
Heck yeah.
I have all my tools. Everything's ready to have to do the work of placing it in there and making sure this all feels right.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's one of the things too that I always talk to other environment artists and artists out there, even character guys, and I'm just like, dude, get in the scene and just whatever game you're working on, and just for the heck of it, like, if you have a couple hours during lunch or whatever like that, or just move stuff around and just build your own little kingdom or like little scene, because it's really just like, not only does it help you kind of understand the assets in your game and stuff that maybe you haven't made, but it really starts letting the creative juices flowing, and it lets people kind of know that like it's such an important part of the process of just kind of placing this stuff. And you see a lot of teams actually have just like dedicated world builders, and just like the only thing they do is kind of like create these places and invert paint for hours, and all that stuff is really really does show. I know you're like, oh please, no. But it's like, just like all that stuff really does show. It's like, gosh, man, it just kind of scratches this itch, especially now with like, depending on like what stuff you're working on, but like some of the cool kind of like blending materials that you're seeing kind of get kicked out of Unreal 4, and like the height map stuff, and then just using stuff like Substance Designer, and being able to kind of really quickly process different materials and have them all work together. It's just super cool. I mean, like between that and just like gathering all the assets that you have and mess around with them, it's a blast.
Yeah.
So
yeah, it's fun.
I know we can talk about this forever, and and we will. We'll definitely.
We
come
literally
back to this.
could, and we literally have before.
We literally have before, yeah. So I guess what would be cool is kind of like, the podcast has been going for a while, and I know you guys have been listening. I think that we should try to switch gears here and maybe just talk about some cool things that we've seen out there, some cool tech, maybe some cool websites, and just talk about that, and then kind of close out here. Ryan, is there anything that you've seen recently that you want to kind of give a shout out to, or anything that you've been kind of working with at home?
Yeah, I mean, well, it's not necessarily fully environment art related, but it was something that I think, kind of harkens back to a little bit of like the foundational work of what we do, right? So like, and not to go on a huge tangent here, but like I do think it's important for environment artists to look outside of ArtStation and looking outside of like the realm of what we have. And even beyond that, right? Like, not just saying, all right, let's go look at like concept art from a film, or let's look at like going beyond that, looking at traditional art, looking at other visual art forms, or just other art forms in general. Because you can learn a lot about that, and you can also see how a lot of the same skills and a lot of the same stuff that we do can sometimes apply to stuff in the real world, right? So like, for us, we don't have to work with the real world and real world conventions, but there's other people that do set design and photography that do have to like rely to that stuff. So
absolutely.
One of the guys that I came across last week when I was just kind of fiddling around on the internet was a photographer, and I need to make sure that I have his name here correctly. It's Gregory Kretson. Kretson? I'm not quite sure. But he did this fantastic, like he's done these series of photos that have these very kind of like cinematic like feel to them. They're mostly all set in very like American suburban towns and small towns, and there's kind of an element of melancholy. There's he's actually apparently very influenced by David Lynch, which is a huge influence of both Justin and I as well.
Heck yeah.
And like it's like there's a documentary about him called Brief Encounter, and it goes over his creation process of how he makes these large photos. And you can do a Google search of Gregory Kretson and just like suburbia, and you'll see this very kind of like beautiful cinematic looking like shots. And what I learned about this is that these shots are usually massive, like in terms of the actual like canvas they sit on when he's printing them out and having them out for a gallery show. And so there's this massive amount of detail in these things that even, like you look at a thumbnail and go, okay, that's nice. But like when you have that context of like, these are massive and it's meant to be seen in that context, it's really impressive. And he's doing stuff that as an environment artist, I found that was very compelling, because he's doing not stuff that, what you would think of as a traditional photographer doing, right? Of like going out and just being very spontaneous and trying to capture stuff in the moment. He's staging everything. He's bringing in basically like a giant film crew into this like small town and setting up all of these shots and hiring models and like going out and like trying to like get permits to like block off sections of the city so he can do these wide shots of just like rows of houses or buildings or the documentary where he has the street closed off and ends up having a guy going down like this row of houses and this little bar that's kind of the focus, and just like wetting the entire road, which, like, as like environment artists, we're like, oh man, yeah, no, wet that road, because like wet ground surfaces always look really nice, right? And
Yeah.
and like when you think about that, you're like, right, yeah, no, if I were to do this in real life, I would have to pay somebody or get somebody to go there, in a car with a hose and like spray down every single little thing, right? He's bringing in giant studio lights to use to like help shoot specific things. He's staging a bunch of different bits, and then he also is going to like sound stages and actually building whole sets as well that he's shooting stuff in, right? So if he has like an interior of somebody that looks like they're in a motel or something, and he wants to be able to have the shot looking through into the bedroom and maybe like the bathroom off to the side and have the doors open and stuff like that, he's building all of that. But great amount of attention to detail paid to his work that is, I find very admirable in terms of the type of work we do, that I think people that aren't necessarily into the scene might think like, wow, you guys are really like micromanaging every single little thing. But it's like, I've been involved with and doing screenshots that you're going to send out to the media, and you have to be meticulous about every single one of those things that you do, right? Like all the way through is like, you put out a trailer, you got to make sure every single one of these shots has, little details here and there and filling it in. People are critiquing it over and over again. And it was very much, again, I felt like this was a kindred spirit in a lot of ways of what we're doing. So, again, the documentary is called Brief Encounter. You can rent it on Amazon. It's about an hour and a half. It's really, really good, though. I highly recommend it. It became one of my instant favorite, like, art documentaries that, like, as soon as I was done, I went back and rewatched it like the next day, in which I rarely ever do for any film at all. So it was like, yeah, this is just really cool stuff.
Hell yeah, dude.
That's what I got.
It's super awesome. I'm looking at his images. I know I saw a few things. We'll have to put them up here in the links, and hopefully maybe I'll throw some images while you in the final version of this. It's just fantastic. I mean, his stuff is super cool. It definitely seems inspired by Twin Peaks for sure. And it's just it's wild. I mean, like, yeah, the one thing that we have logistical concerns of, like, being able to get shaders and everything just to make the streets wet, but to actually have to truck in water trucks and have people squirt down the streets, and then depending on what the temperature is, what time of day it is, like, dude, this is just crazy. Some of these images are just fantastic. It's super cool.
It's crazy, right? And like, he's talking about, like, there's shots in that he's like, I literally only have 20 minutes to take this shot because this is the point where the sun is at, right? Where for us, we're just like, cool, all right, we'll just switch this knob around or change the light around and get it to work, right? And so, it gives you a different perspective on kind of like the work that we do. Like for me, I like seeing that stuff because I think in a way it can help to kind of ground the work you do and give a little bit of a perspective of like, right, would this object actually work in this space?
Heck yeah.
Realistically, right? Unless you're going for something different, right? But
Yeah.
if you're doing something where you want to have reality as a basis and gravity and all the other natural elements tied into that, and in general, like, it's a really, it's cool stuff to see in general.
Heck.
So highly recommended.
Awesome, man. So I have some cool stuff. I know we were talking about, like, getting out of off of ArtStation, but there are some things that just talking about just basically showcasing work. I mean, this stuff's fantastic, and is the one thing that's just really great about talking to you and some of the other artists on Twitter is that you're able to kind of throw these images up, and that's great. But one thing that I really like recently about some of the stuff that's going on in ArtStation is the idea of that ArtStation blog, and kind of getting away from, like, the normal way that we portfolios are kind of portrayed. I love ArtStation, but usually the way that you look at the portfolios, it's just like you don't really see a lot of work in progress unless it's really important to whatever the pieces that they're showing. And being able to kind of move into this direction within an artist website where they're going to end up showing, you're going to end up being able to show inspiration of what you're working on, and maybe put up some of these images in your blog, and then also show some of the work that you're working on, some of your personal work. And then when your portfolio work, you're able to show your portfolio work, you show that on the blog, and then you put in your portfolio. I think is going to be really, really cool. I'm really interested to see where this goes, because anything that kind of really showcases process of artists, especially environment artists, is going to be really, really interesting, because like character artists it's really interesting. You're working with silhouette and you're working with different details on the character, but environment art, just because it's how unwieldy it becomes, in the sense of one level might take multiple people, it's going to be really, really wild to kind of go through and see things kind of break down um, on these blogs, and be a little less um, finished or polished with it. I like the idea of seeing things unfinished, seeing errors made, lessons learned, and I really hope to see this stuff kind of go with the ArtStation blog. The other thing I wanted to talk to you about is I don't know if you got a chance to watch it, but a couple days ago I watched the Overwatch League that Blizzard has just shown, and I was really, really
not.
Yeah, it's pretty awesome. I was really, really impressed with it, and I started having all these ideas and just like discussions with a couple of my friends, a couple dev friends, about, what is this going to mean for environment art? I mean, you're talking about, when you go to see a football game and you go to see a baseball game, you're sitting in stadium seats around a field. We have the ability now to truck cameras around a space in a spectator mode and follow different players playing. That's one thing, but how will the environments in a game like Overwatch or any other esports game kind of change? I remember talking to my friends and almost drawing to an equivalent to years ago, before I went to college. Paintball became really big on the East Coast. I know the West Coast too. It was huge. And they started having arena battles, or like actual like professional sports paintball, and they were trying to get into the Olympics for a while, I remember. But paintball started as like a skirmish battle where you would fight in the woods, and it was known right off the bat that to be able to make this a watchable sport, no one was going to kind of like walk out into the middle of the woods and watch it. I know there's like Red Bull races and everything where people go out in the middle of nowhere and watch dirt bikes and everything, but for something like paintball, they try to solve it with what was called airball and hyperball. They had all these different names for paintball, try to put pizzazz on it, but they would have these sets of inflatable bunkers that they would put around. They were only at certain heights, and they had advertisements on them, and they were different colors. And I'm just curious of what that's going to become. Will we see Overwatch maps with advertisements on them, and the height of the maps will come down? Will they look more like stadiums later on? Will that happen with games like PlayerUnknown Battlegrounds? Will things kind of melt down into more of like a minimalist design with the level design and the way that the art is portrayed? It's just something that I'm constantly thinking about. The more and more that these games are trying to kind of break into this viewership space, into this sports space.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point to kind of consider, right? It's like you think of like sports fields, and they're fairly minimal, right? They're bare bones of like what you need to know in terms of like here's the lines, like here's the batter's box, here's where like here's middle of the field, right? Yep. Like here's where the 3-point line is, like all that stuff is just bare bones with that stuff. Yeah, it's interesting to. I hadn't really thought about that before, but yeah.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to kind of come back and see what happens later on.
No, for sure. But like, so like I was kind of interested in watching this, but at the same time, AGDQ, Awesome Games Done Quick, was going on during the week too, and that's kind of like my I'm not really into speed running, but I really enjoy the fact that these people get together for a skill that like for the most part, it's like, yeah, okay, it's cool to see this stuff, but like, what else are you gonna do, right? But these people spend a lot of time dedicated to this stuff, and then they come together twice a year and they raise millions of dollars over the course of a week for a charity. That's pretty awesome.
Yeah, it's pretty awesome. Yeah.
Fantastic. So, and like, I like to watch it because it's also like cool, like a couple of games I might know, and I can actually see somebody going through this and doing stuff to a game that is just like, oh wow, okay, like there's a guy that beat, I think, the original Ratchet and Clank in like 30 minutes or something on like
that's awesome.
Last Sunday, and like I'm just like, dude, what?
Like, that's pretty awesome.
Wow. but yeah, so like I missed the entire Overwatch League opening, but so being out here in Los Angeles, specifically kind of in the Burbank area, there the arena that I guess they were doing most of this in is actually down the street um, from us at Insomnia. Not totally down the street, but it's in town, right? So
Yeah.
like I'll drive by it a couple nights a week, and for the longest time, like that area, that studio used to be like where Johnny Carson did the Tonight Show, Jay Leno did the Tonight Show, and then after Leno left, NBC used to, I guess, occupy the space. They've left since then, and then the studio's kind of been lingering for a couple of years, and then a couple months ago, Blizzard was like, "All right, we bought a studio out here in Hollywood." And I was like, "Oh, that's cool." And then I drove down one night, and I just saw Blizzard like plastered everywhere on the building. You can see inside of the lobby that's there. It's just like Overwatch, like icons, and like just like what's this? Is crazy. Okay, that's cool. But um, like it's cool to see that like they're trying to do regional teams because I'm not particularly interested all that much in esports. I definitely grew up more of a traditional sports fan, so it's interesting to see that aspect now come into esports that I think can be attractive to people that are more to be interested in that, but haven't necessarily taken the full step in there because you're at least like, okay, I can identify with a team and say this is my right.
Oh, I think I lost you here.
Oh,
Are you still there? Okay.
Yep, I'm still there.
Cool. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Sorry about that.
That's okay.
So yeah, you're basically just talking about the sports teams and the way that they're naming them after the actual cities. It'll be interesting to see what happens. And I'm actually interested to see if that actually expands to other games and how that kind of goes. It would be really interesting to see these kind of like triathlon esports players that are playing Street Fighter all the way over to Overwatch, and these teams end up being these really interesting conglomerates of just different players from different games. So it'll be really interesting to see what happens.
Yeah, no.
Cool. So I have a couple last kind of closing things here. I figured it'd be really kind of cool just because when we go through these podcasts, to kind of just like talk about where our headspace is, what's inspiring us. But we are gamers, we are game developers. Are there any things that you're kind of playing or watching right now, like movies or games that you just want to give a shout out to?
That I'm playing right now this week. I mean, for the last month or so, I've been kind of going back to a lot of older, I guess longer than the last month. If anybody sees my like collection of old games over the last year, but in particular, I ended up acquiring a original NES over the holiday break, and so I've been playing. And I got a flash cart to go with that. Put some ROMs on there. Say what you will, but about that. But like I was like, NES games are super expensive. I don't really want to spend that.
Yeah, man, you're preserving history. Yeah, you're preserving history.
Yeah, exactly. That's so. I can play some like NES Flintstone games that are like $5,000 on eBay.
Oh, that's ridiculous. Yeah,
it's cool to go back to a lot of these older games, and like for myself, I particularly think like the SNES era has so much to do with modern games and kind of what like we do now. Like there's a lot of foundational things that I think hold up today if you go back and play that more than like the NES and certainly more than the Atari or like eras before then, right? So it's interesting to go back to the NES, and there's definitely stuff where you're playing a game and you're just like, checkpoints are bad, or there's no save file option for the stuff. You have to put in passwords, which used to be a thing before, like battery save on like a lot of carts. But there's still fundamental stuff, right? Like you can see an entire industry trying to figure out how to make something really interesting. Particularly looking at like older Nintendo games. it's interesting to see how that evolution jumps into like the Super Nintendo era. So
Man, heck yeah.
yeah, and seeing like these guys that kind of like came together in the mid to late 80s to make a lot of really classic games, then said, all right, what can we do with more powerful hardware and all of the lessons that we've already learned over the last, you know, like 5 to 7 years, right? Like in a lot of cases,
Yeah,
it's
man.
like their college,
Yeah.
and it just so happens like, their school happened to be Nintendo, and like there's Miyamoto, and, you know, are like these geniuses that ended up just like forming everything that we kind of think about as games as a whole.
Yeah.
Um, and like, it doesn't get spoken about often, but like it's kind of crazy to think about just how influential like the original Mario Brothers was to games. Like time after that game, when you thought of a video game, you thought of a 2D platformer.
Yeah.
Like I cannot imagine that now. Like we are so diverse in genres, which is great and fantastic, but it's just like here's a formula of how to do a particular type of game,
I know, man.
and people
It's
just ran with that.
what's crazy about that to me too is just like when you play something like the new Mario Odyssey, how much of that stuff sticks around. Just the pacing and the momentum of the jump, and then even bringing back old NES style platforming into the new game. It just shows that stuff really did break new ground, and it was a huge foundational building block to where we are
Yeah.
today.
Yeah, and like there's a lot of stuff and a lot of games that do interesting things with that formula that I think sometimes don't necessarily get fully mentioned. Like Little Samson, which is like a very obscure NES, like late NES game that is like one of the most expensive carts out there. Does
Yeah.
some really cool kind of like Mega Man in terms of like multiple powers and character switches, and does a really nice like level design layout throughout most of the game. Like that stuff's really cool. Um, even going back and play, and so as a person that never really grew up on Mega Man games, it's interesting to go back and actually be like, those games are really good. Like that's a cool concept to be like,
Heck yeah, man.
pick whatever level you want to go to. There is a rock paper scissors element to this. There's a strategy to this that you have to kind of figure out. And, now it's easy enough because I can go online and be like, all right, what boss should I do first to get his power to get this one? But just the thought of even being like as a kid and having this game and probably spending months or years of my life trying to figure out the right route to take to get to the end of this game, like it's like that's a really powerful formula to consider like nowadays.
Heck yeah.
Like it still feels fresh.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's yeah, and yeah, don't get me started. I'm a huge Mega Man X fan.
Oh man, okay.
We'll have to have like a Mega Man podcast. It'll be tune into our Mega Man podcast.
Yeah.
No, have you played Dead Rising? No. So I guess one last thing I'll end with, just in the sense of like games I've been playing. I've been checking out the Dragon Ball Fighters, however it's pronounced. It's freaking awesome. I was a huge fan of the Arxis Guilty Gear stuff. I'm not a huge fan of Dragon Ball. I just was kind of passed over it at the time. The age when all my buds started watching it, and when I felt like I was kind of ready to try to get into it, Samurai Jack came out, and I watched that instead. So that's how I kind of bypassed it. But coming back and playing this new game and having it be so intentionally made to look like the old manga and anime is just awesome, and it's fun as heck to play. I don't know how to play yet. I play a lot of fighting games, but just getting in there and just not knowing what I'm doing has been one of the better experiences of all the fighters that I've played recently. But other than that, I recently came around to this. My buddy, we talk a lot about music and records at work, but the one thing that kind of broke out to me is there's I'm sure a lot of people know about him, but it's a YouTube guy by the name of Nerdwriter, and he does a bunch of just like breaking down some of his favorite music and movies. And he did something on he did a little breakdown on Dreams or Fleetwood Mac and Rumors, and he kind of focused on the song Dreams. And it was really awesome to kind of go back to that record and when they were working on it in the 70s and start to draw. I do this all the time with music and movies and draw parallels to what we're doing in game development right now, especially. And it just was wild to watch Stevie Nicks, the lead vocalist of Fleetwood Mac, write this song on the piano and then kick it over to the guitarist, Lindsey Buchanan, and he would start adding the guitarist, and then he'd kick it back and they would add something else, and they would kick it to the drummer and he'd add the drums, and he'd kick it to the bassist. And we do a lot of that in game development. But something that I've been really kind of wishing that like we keep moving forward to is just more collaboration in the sense of like, you know, like maybe having, you might have a couple senior environment artists or principal artists that you're tossing like kind of the same map back and forth. And I know a couple studios do that, but just like seeing more of that kind of be integrated into pipelines would be really wild. It's just like kind of almost treating like levels almost as like I mean, like we kind of treat them as paintings already, but like the way that like this kind of like song element to it is like, hey, I'm adding a little stuff over here, and having the time and communication and teamwork to do that, I think is really special. I've had a couple opportunities to do that in the past, and it's always made better products. So like that to me was always like watching that video was a huge inspiration of just like keeping the collaboration up. And I think at one point or another, I'll have to do a personal project with somebody where it's almost like a living corpse type of thing where maybe we pass it back and forth over a year and see where where it goes or something like that. That would be really fun to do.
Yeah, that sounds awesome.
Beautiful corpse, living corpse. I think it's
really like that guy's stuff too. Yeah, the living corpse environment art.
Living corpse environment art.
Yeah. It's a contest you spend over the course of a year to do.
That would be actually pretty.
That sounds like either a really awesome thing or
there's all these health problems that we all gained from doing that. I sat down too long. I can't get up. Yeah. Oh. Anyway, man, we've been talking for a while. I think this is kind of a great stopping point here. I think that the one thing that I would like to say, and thanks Ryan for trying this out with me. I think this is a blast. I hope we can do it again.
Yeah, absolutely.
The one thing I would like to tell like our viewers or more listeners, because of the podcast, is that tune back in. We're going to try to kind of make this into something cool where we're going to get into student stuff. We're going to get into different facets of environment art. I know we kind of did an overview today. That was intentional. But going in and getting some interviews, lighting, tech artists, even getting some character artists in here and talking about back and forth and level designers, I think would be a blast. And just really kind of celebrating environment art and game development for the awesome thing that it is would be, I think, a blast to do. So I just like to thank everyone for tuning in. And I don't know, Ryan, if you want to say anything and close us out, go ahead.
Yeah, no. Oh, hey, look, first off, Justin's really been pushing on this and doing a lot of the legwork for this for like a while. Like, it's like we've been trying to get this going for a while. We both feel like this is a lot of aspiring environment artists, current environment artists, and so we'd like to have a discussion with people. So if there's things you would like to know or questions that you have for us, please contact either one of us. I'm sure we'll probably end up throwing up at some point an actual place to message us if you have specific questions for anything. Because we want to tailor this to people that are in the industry, students, like people that just are just fans of like environment art, which I'm sure there's people out there that are. It's like I have a fine taste of like video game environment art. Anything that you guys want to hear about, kind of like Justin said, we're hoping to have some guests on here at some point as well and do a couple interviews with them. There's a few people that we would like to speak to. So, on the docket, but this is fun. There's a lot of times where, you'll see people talking online about a lot of technical stuff, but we want to kind of talk about the nitty gritty of like, hey, this is how, and also like the artistry of what we do, and really kind of embracing that, because that's also a huge part of what we do, right? Like at the end of the day, we are entertainers to some extent, and so we have to, I feel like we do have to embrace that to some point and entertain people and get people excited and take them through an emotional journey through stuff, beyond just like the craftsmanship of like just as equally important, because we still have, like as much as you might have this emotional intent of what you want to make, if you don't know how to make it, you can't execute on it. It's important to do that. So, let's that's the hope of what we're going to go through journey.
Awesome, dude. Well, thanks a lot, guys. And let's get out of here. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks.